You'll get a little that notification to let you know. Okay, so I think we will get started. Welcome to this section, which is called Introduction to Advanced Qualitative Methods. And Helen and I are going to be taking you through this introductory session. And we put quite a lot of contact details on this slide. And we will also be posting the slides on our blog, and there's a QR code to that a little bit later on in the presentation. We'd like to start by thanking Wizard, the Wales Institute of Social and Economic Research and Data, for hosting this session. And you can read a little bit more about their various activities on the slide. And I'm sure we will add a link to their website when we post the slides and recordings later on. So we wanted to start off by getting a sense of the sorts of research that you guys are already familiar with, the sorts of things that you might be doing in your research or as a practitioner. And we will be using Slido again a little bit later on in the presentation. And for those of you who are not familiar with Slido, you can, we're big on QR codes today, Helen. You can use this QR code or go to simply slido.com and use the hashtag that's there and start adding away to this word cloud. Please keep doing that during the course of the presentation, and we will come back and revisit this slide a little bit later on. It will give us a good sense really of the sort of activities that you're already doing, and the type of research practice that the currently 81 people on the Zoom are involved in. So that'll be really interesting for us to think about, particularly as we maybe plan some future sessions. Right, so what are we planning to do today? So we've called this an introduction to advanced qualitative methods. So we're going to introduce ourselves and our research in a minute, and then we're going to talk a little bit about advanced qualitative methods and why we use that term. And we're then going to do two what we've called taster sessions, although there's no actual food involved, which I realise is probably is a description error, but we're going to introduce both visual methods and material methods and give you a practical example of what we're doing in our research. In both those sessions, we've tried to schedule some time for Q&A, but we'll see how we go, and we've also got a final Q&A slot at the end. But please do post your questions in the chat as we go, because when I'm speaking, Helen will be on chat duty and she will be trying to answer your questions, and vice versa. When Helen's doing the presentation honours, I will be answering questions in the chat. So I hope that means that we'll be able to get through quite a bit. But we've put contact details on these slides, so you'll have plenty of opportunity to get in touch with us after the session if there's more you'd like to know about our research, about the methods. So just to clarify, in this 2-hour session, we're giving an overview of advanced qualitative methods and a taster on visual methods and material methods. So we're not going in depth. We're hoping to introduce you to some new approaches that perhaps you've not tried before, but we will not be giving you quite enough detail in this session to perhaps both be able to go away and start to do a detailed study on your own. So there would be follow-up sessions perhaps that we could run, or you may want to look at alternative, more detailed methods training in these after this session. So about us, Helen, would you like to introduce yourself, since I've been doing all the talking so far?
Yes, hello everyone, I'm Helen. Nice to have so many of you here. It's really fantastic to see that there's so much appetite for learning more about qualitative methodologies and beyond the realms of interviews and thematic analysis. So that's fantastic. I'm based with Katrina. We work together at Swansea University, and I think through the course of this session you will get a flavour of the kind of work that we do and how we do it, and I'm really looking forward to taking you through some exciting methodologies and understanding of methods today.
Thanks, Helen. You can see on this slide, as promised, there's a couple more QR codes. We've really gone QR code mad today.
We love a QR code.
Oh, we do now. We know how to make them. The first one at the top, this is for our Breaking Binaries research website. And on that website, we have a section dedicated to advanced qualitative methods. So on that, you can find a lot more information about publications that we've written and resources that you can use if you want to follow up anything. And also, we wanted explicitly to give a shout out to Braun and Clark and their excellent work on thematic analysis, particularly reflexive thematic analysis. We're not touching that today, and we've put a QR code there to their own website. So if you are interested in following up any more information specifically on reflexive thematic analysis, please do check out their website.
Can I just say something on that, Katrina?
Yeah. Yes,
I'm going to anyway. I've pretended to ask permission to appear polite. I just wanted to say that when it comes to thematic analysis, and just this is really to kind of echo Braun and Clark's sort of more recent work in the area, is there's a tendency to cite their 2006 papers, and I feel a responsibility to say that a lot of their later work and their more recent 2019 beyond publications are worth looking at, because they have developed their thinking around thematic analysis substantially. So for those of you who are engaging or using thematic analysis, please do look at their textbook, which was published in 2020. It's a really, really great book, really accessible, and I would implore you all to have a look at it, because the thinking has very much changed and developed and evolved since their original publication in 2006.
Thanks, Helen. And you'll find details for all their resources on their website, which is really comprehensive too. Okay, so that's about us, and that's our welcome. So we're now going to move on, if I can get slides to move on. And just noting, Helen, we've broken the 100 barrier, so that's very exciting for today's session. I'll keep you busy on the chat. So we wanted to talk about why advanced qualitative methods, and we've summarized this somewhat simplistically, I guess, into two drivers for developing more advanced qualitative method. The first is the pull, and much of this will undoubtedly be obvious to you. It will be things that you're coming across in either your own research or your practice, and it is really about the increasing complexity of the world we live in and the types of things that we're setting about researching. So this, if you like, is the pull. It is the pull from the real world situations that we are trying to unpack in our own research. That can be, as I've indicated on the slides, things like digitalization, our ever increasing multimodal lives. The word of 2022, I think it is now, according to the Collins Dictionary, permacrisis. Somewhat alarmingly, I guess, but the fact that the world is more complex and we are moving through very difficult times, the continuing expansion of the neoliberalism and neoliberal cells, challenges around issues like sustainability, ethics, and inclusivity, and how this all wraps up into grand challenges. So we no doubt all recognise that what we are trying to study is getting harder to identify. It's getting harder to actually pull apart and unpack. And on the other side, if we want to present it as two sides, which I have done, is the push. And here I'm talking about the push from researchers, really, who are seeking to explore the challenges of methodology based on our increasing unpacking of ontological and epistemological issues, but also in terms of really trying to work out how we make sense of the world. And this includes particularly qualitative researchers, I guess, tiring of the notion of just this constant back and forth about, is it numbers or words, is it numbers or words, and really trying to stop that compare and contrasting of quantitative and qualitative, and really getting to grips with what qualitative research can do. And that relates to the second point here in terms of recognizing many of the limitations of perhaps the very traditional notion of qualitative research. Talk to some people and use some illustrative quotes, and at the same time challenging, and here Annette Markham's work is very useful, challenging our own academic notions of data and how perhaps we've started to reify that term. Post-qualitative thinking is encouraging us to move beyond notions of method, and we're also being called to account, really, as researchers, to recognise our own the socio-historical production of our own knowledge, what shapes our understandings of what is good or appropriate research. And within that, there's also been much more challenge to us to reprioritise and reposition maybe the important concepts of things like temporality, time, and materiality, which we're specifically going to focus on later in research. So really what we're saying here is we've got both a view from looking at the world around us that is pulling us towards developing our qualitative research practice. And at the same time, there are academic debates that are really encouraging us to stretch ourselves and think about different forms of data and different ways of engaging as researchers with that data. So we've tried to represent that on this picture, and I had several attempts at this. I decided I probably needed a 6-dimensional model, which even my PowerPoint skills couldn't really stretch to. And this was a way of pulling together this idea of the push and the pull, to say that we've always been interested in qualitative research, some sort of connections between these elements, whether we're looking at an individual or groups of individuals, where they're situated within some form of community, whether that's a social community, a work-based community, a professional community, some aspect of place, whether that's, a real physical geographical place or a virtual or some combination, and some element of time. We want to know how they're doing now, what their views on the past or plans for the future are. And often in traditional qualitative methods, we've really had to simplify how we tackle this diagram in order to look at really quite basic relational aspects. It's been one of the real challenges of qualitative research. And that is not to say that there is great methods and methodologies out there that we can use this. We're not even touching today on things like ethnographic research, discourse analysis, although that does get a mention on one of the slides, and those sorts of more other methods. But really what we're here is also challenging the fact that a lot of what we've done in qualitative research has given primacy to the text, to words, as our way of accessing meaning. And what we're going to do in the session today is really to unpack that a little more. So what we are suggesting is that the sorts of advanced qualitative methods that we're going to talk about today, and that will be a taster on visual methods, for those who were arriving more recently, and a taster on material methods, is to say that these advanced qualitative methods allow for more complexity in our research, and they don't only highlight other modalities, but they really require us to think about other forms of data other than text. Now, that's not to say that they're not without challenge, or that they are somehow better or a silver bullet in terms of qualitative research, and we'll certainly highlight both pros and cons as we go later into the taster sessions, but we certainly feel they have a really important place to play in helping us unpack these more complex aspects that we're trying to research. So I'm now going to be handing over to Helen, but I'm in charge of the slides, Helen, so you're going to have to ask me, I think, to move on when you're ready.
Always maintaining that aspect of power, just there. So I think where this sits really, and what we want to take you through today, is about reorientation and thinking about the way that you collect your data, thinking about the questions that you're asking before you're even thinking about collecting your data. And you know, many of you here today may have been more familiar with quantitative approaches, or some of you may have just recently come across or be introduced to qualitative approaches. Conversely, some of you may be exceptionally experienced within the qualitative realms, in which case we'd love you to contribute to the conversations we're having. And I think one of the points to make is that the way that you think about your data is entirely dependent on the questions that you're asking and what you want to get from it. So similarly, as you wouldn't use particular programs or particular codes to be able to ask certain questions about your numerical data, the same goes for other forms of data as well. And what you see in front of you is probably within the qualitative realm. All of you will be very much familiar with this process, where we fundamentally want to understand our participants' experiences, or multiple participants' experiences within a particular topic. So we then conduct a research interview to gather a particular type of data. Normally that is through a dialogue with a participant, and that dialogue is then transcribed into textual data, and then we generate some meanings from that data, which we tend to thematize or put into categories in some way. Today, what we really want you to think about, next slide, please, Katrina. I'm going to do that in my officious voice, if I can. And what we really want you to think about today is that there are different ways of doing it, and there are different ways of thinking about data, but also that it's about thinking about your position and orientation in relation to your data as well. You know, where is your starting point with what you want to find out? So an example that we'll be going through today is thinking about material methods and using materials in your research, but in particular, thinking about using materials to enhance the data that you collect. So an example here is taking what we call a phenomenological perspective, which is about really having a commitment to understanding your participants' worlds at the kind of individual experiential level. And you're interested not necessarily on what's shaping your participant from the level of discourse, for example. What you're interested in is really trying to get into that participant's head, trying to understand their world. How do they make sense of their experiences? What might be impacting that from their perspective? So to do that, and if you start from that perspective, then you know to be able to adhere to the commitments of phenomenology, you know you need a certain level of depth to your data to really do justice, to be able to understand that participant's world or that group of participants' world in the depth and level needed to be able to meet those commitments. So when you think about the interview, and something that we'll be discussing in the material methods section is the research interview. Personally, and a number of other scholars would agree with this, that I see the research interview as quite an exclusionary practice, in that there will only be particular kinds of people that can participate in the research interview that have the levels of oral fluency, the ability to reflect, and the level of the depth needed within the certain time constraints that you have. And so this then lends itself to the question, well, what can we do to enable participants to be able to access the level of consciousness and reflection needed to provide that level of depth, to get that level of understanding? So that's where you then orientate yourself perhaps to thinking about other forms of modality and other forms of communication that can happen within that research interview. So the use of materials to enhance that is just one way of doing that. Next slide, please. The other way that we tend to think about qualitative methods is through thinking about broader understandings of discourses and discursive practices. So how things outside shape people, shape the way that we talk to each other, shape the way that organizations form, culture, for example. And traditionally, that tends to form the process that's right in front of you. So we tend to look particularly at textual data to be able to understand that, organizational websites to understand organizational cultures, organizational documents to understand particular discursive practices that happen within particular organizations. And again, following that similar process, we tend to use textual analysis, and that focus on text is that kind of sort of monomodal form of communication and understanding. And we then follow an analytic method, which tends again about bucketing meanings and drawing themes from that. So we form that sort of very similar process. When we move along, we think about advancing those understandings. Next slide, please. Thank you. Oh, you're almost there that time. We then think about different ways that we can understand the world. Again, as Katrina was talking about, data is not just about text. Data is not just about conversation. Data is all around us and is multifaceted in exceptional ways. And one particular example through the visual methods taster session, we'll look into some of the work that we've done and Katrina's done, which tries to understand images and the analysis of images. So that's sort of one again mode of how we see the world, and then also use of text alongside that. And again, there are different ways to analyze, so not just doing the traditional sort of thematic analysis or content analysis, but it's about thinking about using discursive analysis and visual analysis. And again, just on that, thinking about, and I'm sure Katrina's will touch upon this in the visual methods, but in terms of the way that we categorize data and also we categorize methods, we tend to reject those understandings because we tend to find that particular forms of data are valued over others, but there's not really much understanding as to where that value comes from, apart from how particular bodies of knowledge become valued over others. So what we're trying to stress today, and to get you to think differently perhaps, is to try and park your assumptions today. Try and think and rethink about what data is or could potentially be. Think about how you understand the world beyond just language. We are sense making in particular ways, and we make sense of things in particular ways. We see the world, we smell the world, we hear the world, we see the world, we touch the world around us. For some people, those senses are more emphasized than others because they perhaps don't have sight, or they don't have hearing, or they don't have touch, but they will sense and they will feel and they will understand the world in particular ways. And we have a responsibility to some extent to try and understand the complexities that come with understanding that world. And that really leads us to this idea of advanced qualitative methods in trying to unpack the complexities and understanding that everything is connected to some extent in some way. And it's about unpacking and trying to unpack those connections, but not simplifying them, simply understanding them. Next slide. So that leads us to the session and how we're going to unpack and try in the relatively short period of time. We could probably talk about this for weeks. Well, I certainly could anyway. Multiple weeks with multiple pints. Obviously, we've done the welcome. We've talked a little bit about advanced qualitative methods. I can see some questions coming in already, which is great. So we're going to start off by talking about visual methods, and Katrina's going to kick us off with that. And then we're going to take a bit of a break after the visual methods. So you can grab a piece of cake, a protein bar, protein shake, go for a 5K run, maybe finish a marathon and come back. And after you've done all that, we'll then do some material methods where I'll take you through a method that we've used, as well as really thinking about orientating yourself differently towards materials in research. And then we're going to wrap up with some questions and answers. So if you've got anything that you're unsure of or thinking about, or you want more information on, then pop them into the chat or save them to the end and we'll answer them then.
Okay, thanks very much, Helen. As I mentioned at the start, we're really just providing an introduction to these methods today, and so our aim is to be thought-provoking at the beginning, and then hopefully in these next 2 sessions really walk you through some of our own research. So in both the visual methods taster and the material methods taster, it's not just us talking in isolation about the methods, but really walking through an actual example. So let's start then with the visual methods taster. So I wanted to start in both by specifically unpacking why we should study images. It's certainly visual research has been around for a very long time, certainly in pockets of social science research. In our area, in management research, it's perhaps been a little bit on the periphery even for a while, but certainly recently, as you can see from the quotes on the slides, particularly since 2010, there's been much more concern with looking at visual representation, partly because we are immersed in images in online environments, and most of our interactions have some visual element to them, whether they're sort of pre-prepared or not. One way of thinking about different types of visual research is to consider whether the images that you're going to look at originate within the context of the research project itself, or whether you are interested in looking at images that exist outside the research project. So, for example, when you're looking at images generated in the research project, you might be asking participants, we used to give them little disposable cameras, but we don't really need to do that anymore. You might be asking participants to take images themselves, perhaps as part of a diary study, or you might be taking images with participants, perhaps as part of an ethnography, or you may be asking participants to send you or connect to hashtags on a social media site like Instagram. Other social media sites are available in order to look at the data. So those would fit in the left-hand circle here, oval, images generated through it and within research. I'm going to talk more about, or almost exclusively about, images that are curated through research project. That is, that they exist already outside the research endeavour, and the research is seeking to identify images that relate to a particular topic or topics, and then study them. There are, of course, many ways that you can then look at those images, and I'm going to walk through some particular examples. But obviously, this is a highly simplified view of visual research, and there is a lot of work out there. Some of the authors are cited here, and we'll be providing a reference list on our project website that you can go and have a look at to read more about visual research. But this basic notion of whether the image exists and is generated within the research or is already there is quite a useful way of really thinking about that in the first place. So what have we been doing, or what have I been doing, I guess, with visual images? I thought it was useful to talk a little bit about my own journey in visual research as part of this, because there has been quite a change with how I've adapted my own research practice. One of the first papers that I was involved with in visual research was back in 2005, research that sort of started really in 2010, where with a colleague, Rebecca Whiting, who's at Birkbeck, she and I looked at representations of ageing. And at that stage, we used Davison's portrait codes, and I'll say a little bit more about those in a minute. We used that to analyse really quite a small number of images. I think there were less than 10 images in that particular data set. But in a nod to what Helen's going to be talking about a little bit later, we did also do photo elicitation with those images. That is, we didn't rely just on our own analysis. We took the images to others to see what their reaction was. Now, Gillian Rose's work is referenced on the slides and is particularly helpful in helping us think about these different ways of looking at images, because Rose discusses different sites of images, and she talks about the site of the site of audiencing, which is the response of others to images. So in that first research project, we were specifically looking at how others responded to the images we had curated. However, one of the frustrations that I had was the tendency for visual research, for qualitative visual research, to focus on quite small data sets of images. And so subsequently, I've looked at ways of both collecting and analysing much larger data sets. And so the middle box here represents work, methodological work that I put together on a means of analysing. In this case, it was 234 images representing human resource management. And that really was about trying to bring together different work that had already been done, particularly around compositional analysis of images, but to keep the image centre stage. And again, I'll give you a practical example of this in a minute. And this then led on to the last box, which is the one I'm going to walk through. Sorry, I've just managed to make the chat huge and cover the screen up, which is the most recent work that Helen and I have been involved in with a colleague, Maggie Miller, who's also with us at Swansea, looking at 248 images of male and female entrepreneurs. And the significant change between the middle box, where I was looking at more images, and the last box is that no longer was we trying to look at images in one particular site online. We were actually following or tracing images to see where they were used. So that's the example that I'm going to talk through in this taster session. So how did we find the images, which is the first challenge if you're curating images that you want to analyse? In this particular work, as I said, we were interested in firstly identifying some popular images and then following them, if you like. We called it tracing them, but you could also say we were following or tracking them online to see where they appeared and where they were used and in what context. In this particular research, we focused in on images of entrepreneurship, but if you go to our website or have a look at the paper, you'll see that the images that we found we used to represent all sorts of different things, not just entrepreneurship. So the 248 images was those narrowed down just to that particular context. To do this, we used Google image search, and elsewhere and outside the scope of a taster session, there is some really interesting debate about the algorithmic nature of online searching, the platformization of our research practice, and sorry, the dog's kicking off in the background, and the challenges of that for research. So we started where it says start here, and we identified initially a top 10 popular images of male and female entrepreneurs, and then we used those and traced them by using reverse image searches across various online spaces. And we looked at 3 online spaces in particular: image libraries, search engines, and online media. So if you're interested in this type of research and you're interested in looking at images online, obviously it's really important to have some basis for what online means in your research. That would be true whether you were looking for texts or videos or any form of data online. So that's certainly something we'd suggest that researchers need to attend to. But let's focus in now on the visual research and how we actually dealt with and analysed the images that we collected. So this picture shows how we pulled together different analytic methods. And in some senses, I would argue that what we've done here is mixed methods research. It's mixed qualitative methods research. And I think there is increasingly more attention to the ways in which we combine different approaches to understanding data within single qualitative studies. Mixed methods does not only have to refer to a combination of quantitative and qualitative research. So essentially here we pulled in 3 different approaches, one of which I've already mentioned. I developed, which we call combined visual analysis. That itself is already a combination. It's a combination particularly drawing on Rose's work on composition analysis and quite a lot of different authors, but particularly Makin and Van Leeuwen on semiotic analysis. And in combined visual analysis, the emphasis is on keeping the visual center stage and using montage approaches in which you physically put different images together so that we are not replacing the visual with a code that is a word or a lexical code. So we keep the image center to the analysis. And there are 3 levels on that. Categorical compositional, which basically is an understanding of what these images are of. So a sort of basic descriptive analysis in some sense. Then we move down the levels of analysis to get deeper and do some thematic compositional analysis. And that does draw on some of the basic tenets of thematic analysis in understanding composition. And lastly, into the sort of deepest level, if you like, we look at semiotic analysis. But in this project, we also pulled in Davison's portraiture codes. You may remember those from earlier. Davison's work originates in critical accounting studies, looking at the representations of portraits in annual reports, and is a very useful summary method that draws on a lot of good visual methods work outside the sort of management and organisation field to actually suggest some way of coding portrait focused images. And then lastly, because it was necessary in terms of the way in which the images we looked at were composed, we went into visual theory. So we went outside the bounds of management and organisation studies, and we read up and looked at ways in which both gaze and gesture were understood by visual theorists and pulled that into our research. So what you have here then, at one level, is a relatively simple slide that has a few methods on it. But on the other hand, you can see how this is a careful combination of analytic approaches. And certainly we would say that this sort of combination, these qual-qual methods, if you like, are a particular feature of advanced qualitative research. So what I'm going to do now is then just walk through how we applied each of these specifics with some examples of the visual data that we were looking at. Excuse me for 1 second.
That's an awful lot of water, Katrina.
I'm not going to drink it all, you'll be pleased to know, otherwise I'll be disappearing. Right, so we started off, if you remember on our tracing journey, we started with something that we called top images. These were the most popular images, and we've written elsewhere, as I've said, about the detailed way in which we identified the most popular images, taking account of or recognizing that there is an algorithmic influence on these. In this research, we excluded images of named entrepreneurs. That is to say, you won't find Steve Jobs or Richard Branson or Sheryl Sandberg in our data set. We were particularly interested in what we called everyday entrepreneurs. And so what our data set of our top images produced a mix of image bank images, so stock images is another term for those, and also if you look at the bottom of the screen, the gentleman adjusting his cuffs there, some of these images came from fashion magazines but were reused as images of entrepreneurs. And so in this analysis, we essentially, you physically scroll all over an image, although because we were doing this research during the pandemic, we did quite a lot of it online using PowerPoint and other tools. You can use qualitative analysis software if you so wish. And we were walking through the detailed codes that Davison suggests and unpacking those. And one of the interesting dynamics or highlights of this analysis was the different way in which men and women were situated in the images. So, for example, and you can sort of get a sense of this by looking at the two male images, they tended to be apart from the work that was being performed. And probably the contrast is most clear for the two top female images there, or top of the slide, in which the female images were usually performing some form of office-based work. Unlike the male images, the women were largely contained by office furniture, often surrounded by it, sat behind desks, behind computer screens. And so there were some particular differences in the way that which genders were coded through these images. We also spent a lot of time looking at teeth and hair, which I'll go on to in a minute. I'll talk about gesture, but just a word on hair. We were very impressed by the generally flowing, luscious locks of most of the female images we saw. And there is obviously a glamour element present, which you can relate to issues around aesthetic labour. But the purpose of today's presentation is not so much to go into the sort of the detailed analytic findings, but to talk you through the method. So we'll just leave those there as a taster, really, or a spoiler for looking at the research in a bit more detail and perhaps another occasion. So the second way in which we analysed these images was in applying the combined visual analysis mode of analysis. And I realise that you will not be able to read the detail of the tables that I've presented here, but I just wanted to give them as an indication of the way in which we traced composition. So we did detailed compositional analysis, and what we then looked at was how that varied across the different online spaces that we looked at. So some types of images were found in all the different online spaces. So, for example, the top row in the tracing composition across male images showed that there were lots of, and we found them across the different spaces, these individual men. A demand gaze is one in which the subject of the image is engaging you directly as a viewer, so they're sort of staring out of the image, with folded arms and not showing any activity. Those we found across all the spaces. So what you can start to see that we were doing here was trying to map different types of image use across different spaces. So this is where you've got both this more detailed visual analysis and you have more detailed interrogation of the location in which we found the images. Just a few other highlights, I guess, to point out here is this notion of work and office-based imagery for the female images continued, but we also found perhaps some unsurprisingly, but rather depressingly, really, quite a lot of stereotypical feminine work. So here you'll see the example of makeup being applied. There was a lot of care type orientation, so looking after others, whether that was children or the elderly, etc. But intriguingly, a lot more images in the female set where they were with other people. In contrast, being with others was much less common and was more restricted in the type of online environment that we found it in. There were also some more comedic, almost taking the mick out of being with others, sort of ironic images, I guess, that you could see in that basis. And we also looked not just at photographic images, but we looked at cartoons, and we looked at graphics and other representations. And you'll see in a minute, particularly how we looked at the way in which those were. But time, money, growth, and all those sorts of things featured, particularly in the male images, where again, there were more feminized and often pink images appearing with the women. So that's just a taste. Recognize that we're going through this relatively quickly, but it really is just to give you a bit of an insight into the sorts of approaches that we're dealing with when we are looking at visual images. I guess the real point to make here is that I don't think it is possible to start analysing images without really engaging with visual methods and the extensive understanding that there is of the visual in a number of different areas. I think that it is somewhat, there is a risk perhaps that we try and apply some rather basic sort of organising mechanisms of coding and theming visual without actually getting into this more detailed understanding of what the visual is. And that's really where I'm coming to now. So the other thing that we did in our analysis of the 248 images was to look at specific visual features. I've already mentioned gaze. We did a whole analysis, which there isn't time, unfortunately, to go into today, on the way in which the eye direction of the men and women, different, whether that was a demand gaze, looking within the picture, looking at others within the picture, etc., to look at the way in which that was gendered. But I did want to mention hands. So hands and gesture were another very specific visual feature that we looked at, and we drew on visual theory here to help us understand this. And so we went through and did this visual montage of different images with hands, and you can start to get a sense here of some of the differences that I'm just sort of summarizing here. So we found very much that men's hands filled and connected spaces and really worked to underline entrepreneurial values. So there was an awful lot, as you can see here, of men looking at watches, holding money. Time and money featured a lot, lots of graphs that were being held. The megaphone at the bottom, thought I'd put this somewhere else, but the megaphone at the bottom is a man sitting on a desk shouting at other people. So that's one of the ironic images. And you've got leaning against glass panes to sort of use a trope around reflection, folding arms, being in charge and celebrating success. In contrast, when we looked at the female images, this was the only place that we really found worry or concern. And so there was quite a lot of being puzzled, whether you've got, you know, your head in your hands or being tired. And And interestingly, you know, women entrepreneurs apparently play with their hair, but who knew? Who knew? And you can see here representations of care as well. Also, very interestingly, men don't drink coffee in these images. Women, however, do tend to have a cup to hand. And so that sort of element of domesticity playing out in these images too. So as I say, this was about really understanding visual theory around both gaze and gesture, and then using that detailed understanding to bring together, to montage pictures around each of those features to try and make sense of those in terms of our research questions, which was around entrepreneurial femininities and masculinities. So that's a very quick run through one project on visual methods. And what we wanted to do then is to reflect a little bit on the types of sort of opportunities and challenges that emerge from taking this sort of approach. So I think one of the definite benefits, and it's been something that I've been building up sort of knowledge of over the last sort of 10 or 12 years, is really moving away from this emphasis on words, moving away from lexical perspectives in analysis, and trying to look at both different forms of data and also different ways of doing analysis. So in the work that we have done, we've really focused on keeping the image center stage and using these montage approaches rather than just coding an image with words like hands or tired. We've been using the images to keep that center stage in our analysis. We've been really ensuring that visual is given you know, a lot of recognition in research. If we're looking at a website, for example, or if we're looking online to look at an area of research interest, there still has been quite a lot of tendency to perhaps focus in on the text and to almost disregard the images that go along. Often you'll find a lot of attention given to online media construction of gender, for example, but it does often focus on perhaps written accounts on online news sites, and the images tend to be ignored. What we haven't covered here deliberately, because these are only taster sessions, is how this provides a basis for moving to a multimodal perspective. And that would be in which you would be combining the different modes within the data, the different modalities within the data to do a little bit as what Helen was mentioning earlier, that sort of multisensory analytic approach. That would definitely take up a whole 2-hour session and is particularly challenging because you're not only then worrying about how to do the visual analysis, you're then trying to integrate your visual analysis with all the other modalities. One of the real advantages, I think, particularly if you're working in, as we are, in a management school, is that looking at visual research provides a really good prompt to engage with methodological debates beyond your disciplinary boundaries. And I would really encourage that. I think you can learn a lot from the ways in which different topics are researched and different ideas are explored outside your own boundaries. I'd certainly think that understanding methodology is as important as understanding your topic, for example, when it comes to PhD research. And so that's a really useful thing, I think, to be able to do. The other opportunity, which is something that we've become very conscious of, is that you do suddenly become alert to images. And you become alert to image use anywhere. Anyone who's here who follows me on Twitter will know that we're constantly calling out stock images used by all sorts of organisations. And we're not just talking about the Daily Mail or the Telegraph or the Guardian or these images being used in by the big media players. we're talking about them appearing on all sorts of places, whether that's on an organizational website, or on a blog, or on a graphic promoting a particular event. So you do become very alert to it, and it's something that for those of us in academia that have teaching responsibilities, certainly starting to scrutinise your own or our own use of images is a really important aspect, I think, to this. There are undoubtedly challenges with doing this. It's not necessarily straightforward, and if you have no background in visual research, then it can be really challenging to learn and to develop those skills. It's particularly challenging to maintain an appropriate reflexive engagement with the images, just because of how we respond to images generally. There will be some that you feel intrigued by, some that you feel repelled by, and how you manage that reflexivity in your research is really critical. This is undoubtedly something that requires ongoing reflexivity. Keeping the image central is challenging. There are a number of quantitative content-based analysis approaches which will offer a means of dealing with large visual data sets, and that's not to say that those aren't out there, they definitely are, but our approach is very much about keeping the image center. Montage isn't straightforward. It's a bit like any form of qualitative analysis where you feel the desire to spread it all out over the floor. But we are lucky in that there are tools, and quite frankly, PowerPoint is probably good enough for most approaches, in which case you can actually build montages by cutting images and putting them together. It is challenging to work out how you trace an image across different online environments, and when to stop. And that's always a challenge in any form of research. When do you know you've finished? And that really is about defining the bounds of your research topic and your research question. Instability is perhaps the wrong word here, but online environments change all the time. So you can go and look at we're just doing some new research at the minute, following images that are used for World Menopause Day, for example. You can go and look at a site and see one image, you can go back another, and both the image and the text may have changed. Online sites get updated all the time, and so you do need to be careful, and collecting metadata on what you've gathered when is really important in this. There are both ethical and copyright issues here. That is definitely the subject for another session, though, but you do have to be very sensitive to that, and I think it's really important to engage with that. We, in publishing, use a clip thumbnail approach, which is akin to quoting an image, and that we have found that publishers are relatively comfortable with. And lastly, and I know Helen is going to come on to this when she gets to the end of her material methods section, is there is perhaps sometimes a perception that we're just playing around with images, that this isn't serious research. But I hope by walking through some of the more detailed analytic methods that we're using, we can put that one to bed for once and for all. And obviously this is research that we've had published in quality academic journals. And certainly I think that it would be a mistake to assume that somehow words are serious and pictures are not. I think, as many people have quoted, I think it's Mayer et al. Who say, images are not mere windows on the world, they are themselves constructs. And so if you're interested in the way in which we come to understand the world, we do really have to take images as seriously as words. Right, I'm going to stop there for a minute and have a quick drink. And I think we are going to do a short Q&A on the basis of that. Helen, I don't know if there are questions in the chat that you
absolutely. I have been like a road runner trying to answer them, but I think you can do a better job than me on some of these. I also feel like I'm hosting a jazzy radio show right now, which is quite good. I feel like
yeah, don't get ahead of yourself.
We are hoping to do a podcast though.
No, don't say that to public, to 100 people. That means we've definitely got to do it.
It's nothing like a deadline, right? So we've had some really good questions coming through. I'll just scroll up and see. So we'll start with so Gabrielle talked a little bit, asked a question about something you touched upon with the fact that obviously we're dealing with algorithms and algorithms change, and was talking about replication and how you account for that.
I don't, is the bottom line. This is, I think we have to embrace the subjectivity that comes with research. And this relates to that point I just said about instability. There is no guarantee that if you went to talk to someone, they'd say the same thing one day or the next. There is no guarantee that if I fill in a questionnaire today, that I will tick the same boxes that I do the next. You have to reflect on and embrace the subjectivity that is around exploring visual data online. I would argue that that's true for any approach, whether that's to do with the visual research or any aspect of online environments. There's quite some interesting discussions emerging, and we can certainly put a couple of references on the website about this notion of algorithms and the fact that we are using the word algorithm often very incorrectly. And I know we've been challenged by reviewers to explain how we could have stepped outside the algorithm. Well, the answer is there's no single algorithm, and also you can't really step outside the online processes. It's the fact that you are replicating some of those search processes that anyone might do that's important. So I sort of probably drifted away from the question.
No, I would also just add to that. I think it's also important and perhaps significant just to talk about algorithms that they're not separate to what we do, and that they are informed by what we do. They don't have their own, for example, machine learning. I have a big problem with the concept of machine learning. This idea that it's almost talking about, Fukuyama's like cyborg theory, and that machines will have their own agency at some point, and that is a whole realm which we're not going to talk about today. But there is this sort of common assumption that the algorithm has the ability to think to oneself and act without us interacting with it.
Yeah, I mean, I think there are some practical things that we do. One of the things that we are perhaps more concerned about when we're doing online searches for any sort of data is ensuring basics, your virus protection is up to date. I wouldn't do any of this on my home computer, for example. We do tend to use desktops at work that we don't use for personal reasons. We clear all the caches, clear the cookies, clear all that down. So there are a lot of practical steps that you can do, and obviously then being reflexive about the context within which searches were carried out.
Okay, being mindful that a lot of individuals here today are from government and public sector organisations, one of the repeated questions that has come up is around the sort of practicalities around how do we do this? We have limited time, we have limited resource. We need to be able to persuade people to release resource for us to do this. What are some practical tips, or thinking around how do we get this to do? How can we make this happen within our own organisations?
Well, I think there are a number of tips, I would say. One is that organisations use a lot of images already. So I think there is some, it's often useful to do a visual audit. If you're in an organisation, to say what images, what is our visual presentation to the world? What images do we use? How do we format them? Where do we present them? What do we show of ourselves, and how do we show it? And I think sometimes, and certainly this is something that has happened when I've done research, you do that, it starts shaping questions that people then want asked. You can look at the images that are on the walls also in a building, or it doesn't have to be, images online or in a report. But also, I do think that collecting visual data, curating it for images that already exist, on the whole, is relatively quick and relatively cheap. The effort is in the analysis. And I think then it's about deciding how deep you want to go in the analysis, and whether you can. Some research has done large data sets, done some very high level coding, and perhaps focused in then. So we tended to do all our analysis across all 240, whatever it was, 3 images. But some approaches, Delmestry's research on university logos, for example, I think did this, collected them all, then grouped them roughly into themes, and then selected one image from each theme for a deep analysis. It's not necessarily how I would approach it, but if you need to do something to get people's attention, that enables you to sort of move through that analytic phase relatively quickly.
Okay,
one more.
One more. Okay. And just to say, we have a second half coming up. But we have a break beforehand, so do hang tight. So just one quick question from Rita, who was talking about if there is a rule of thumb for the minimum amount of how many images should be collected.
It depends what the research question is and how your analysis is shaped. As I mentioned, with the original work that we did on stock images and aging, we took 10 images and we used those in a photo elicitation exercise. I can't quite remember how many people we had in that, but it would have been 50 or 60, I would have thought. And so that was a slightly different approach with a smaller number of images. It is about making it manageable, and we originally collected a lot more than that. But we focused in on all those sites that were stating that the image was used as a representation of an entrepreneur. And we've done more focused research where we then focused in again on work that we've got ongoing, where we've actually then looked again at those that represented entrepreneurial advice. So I think it's the classic qualitative question, isn't it? How many do you need? Which is an irony, I think, really. But I think with visuals, you will find that there are studies that use very few, but they're doing it really in depth. And the more you use, obviously you then have to make some trade-offs in that, depending a little bit on your level of experience, I would suggest.
Rita's happy with that answer.
Oh, good. Thank you, Rita.
We can't promise a podcast either. Right, final question, and then we'll come back to some of these. So we've got, I'm doing an online ethnography, fantastic, yeah. Based on sustainable fashion, even better.
Very interesting.
I'm wearing very sustainable clothing right now. I've worn it for a few days, no, I'm kidding. Therefore, looking at posts shared across Instagram and videos on YouTube.
Question, is it?
Yeah, the posts have both pictures and text. I'm coming to the question now. Sometimes it is a bit confusing to focus on both and analyze both. Do you have any suggestions to the analysis of visual and textual data?
Which was the one thing we said we were going to do today.
We'll do another session.
Yes, I do. I think it probably depends a little bit on your research question in terms of how you are positioning text and visual, and that also depends, I mean, on the site that you're looking. Instagram positions them differently than if you're just doing a general web search, or if you're looking at Facebook or whatever. So the answer is it does really depend. I think often we have used or definitely enrolled the text that is attached to the image. So if there is a subheading, heading, or something that is part of the image, then that is subject to the visual analysis, if that makes sense. But we've used discourse analysis particularly alongside visual analysis. That's something that we're doing with that work I just mentioned on advice. So again, it depends a little bit on the relationality in situ, because that should drive what the relationality is in the actual analysis. Okay.
Yeah.
So I will go on and have a look through the questions. If we don't get to any today, what we will do is we will take the questions and we'll do a Q&A. She says committing Helen and I to more work, and we'll post that on the website too afterwards. Obviously taking all your names and everything off, we'll just do those in a generic way. I think we've got a break now, which I didn't do a slide for, I don't think. So we're going to take a quick 5-minute break. If anyone would like to, I'd just like to say, Helen, we're on time. I would take a quick 5-minute break. I'm going to pause the recording. And we are, so we've resumed. There's a few, looks like there's a bit of response on the chat there for you, Helen.
Okay. 2 thumbs up. Great. No, I know there was more. Okay, so we're now going to move on to the second half of the session, and really to set it up, we were focused very much on images and particularly static images in that session that Katrina just ran and took us through. Then we're now going to think much more about materials. But to start us off, if you could pop to the next slide, please, Katrina. Thank you. And Katrina will now be doing the chat function in an expert way, obviously. So I'm going to talk about creative methods and what's called the material turn, this idea of stuff, of things in research and what it means. And this really goes right back to the beginning when I was talking about moving beyond just textual data and thinking about data in different ways, but also how we generate data and how we construct and reconstruct data with participants or as researchers or with as researchers with participants, and how that process happens. And for me, it's about really reorientating yourself and thinking about the research process as a fundamentally creative process, in that you are creating something. That thing may not be a new thing, it might be a reconstruction of some knowledge, you might be challenging or critiquing a body of knowledge in some way, but fundamentally it's a creative process, and it involves you, your researchers, your research team, your participants, and it's about thinking about all those different elements coming together. When we think about the material and what materials mean, it means that we need to take a step back and think about what I've called the totality of our experiences. We don't just experience the world through words and through conversation. We experience the world in a whole multitude of ways, through a multitude of senses, and those senses are multifaceted, and people experience those senses in different ways. And one of the ways to understand how and begin to unpack the complexity of that, because fundamentally it is complex, and often it's simplified in language. I mean, language is beautiful and we can use it and in particular ways, but particular people can do that. And so there's something that I've called aesthetic knowledge. It's not mine, it's my term, of course. It's nothing is new in academia, it's always borrowed from somebody else, but this idea of aesthetic knowledge, and that we live our worlds beyond meanings and just words, and actually organizational life, you know, our public, our personal lives, however you want to encapsulate that, we experience the world in different ways. And for me and for Katrina, one of the things that we spend a lot of time thinking about, or perhaps me, is this idea of that, how do we capture that? How do we capture that and disseminate that and communicate that? And also, one of the things that's come across today is this idea of multimodality. And while we had that fantastic question on how do I analyze text and how do I analyze the image, and that is a struggle, and that's something which, when we're thinking about advancing qualitative understandings of what data is, of what knowledge is, and the relationship between the two, actually understanding, you know, when we see an image and we see text, what impact does that have on each other? Do they have impact on each other? Similarly, when we're taking that step back further and we think about the world around us, how does that impact us? How do we impact that world? And starting to, no, it's fine, you can go on now. I was at the end anyway. And that's where I started, and where we started thinking about, well, when we're using research interviews and just interviews, and the restriction that just conversation has and can have, how do we go beyond that? How do we try and understand people's worlds beyond the means of language? And really, what is it that matters? As a researcher, to you, to me, to Katrina, what is it that really matters? And I think part of sitting here today, and some of you won't be from a research background, some of you are sitting, you know, in all sorts of different roles and will be conducting research in different ways. Some of you will be doing research without it even being classed, you know, as research, but you will be doing it even if you don't realize it. And fundamentally, it's about what's important to you. What is it about other people's worlds that you're interested in, and how do you want to find that out? For me, what matters is being able to capture people's worlds, the way that they understand them, and being able to find ways to communicate that isn't mediated to such an extent that those meanings are lost, and those particularly significant meanings those individuals are lost. So that's really where material and using material and understanding the impact of things in research comes in. We use things all the time, every single day. You know, we are surrounded by objects, and yet we pay very little attention to them because they're just part of our everyday experiences. Can you move to the next slide, please, Katrina, while you're tweeting? Just retweeting Guardian articles. So when we're thinking about the world in which we situate ourselves in, one of the key things to think about is, how do we find out about that? And one of the starting points, I mentioned this at the start of today, is about that research interview. And fundamentally, when people think about qualitative research, people just think about the fact that we collect data as qualitative researchers through research interviews. And as I mentioned at the start, I have a slight problem with research interviews in how they are often the go-to. So you're going to do some qualitative research, let's go and do some interviews. Just like if you were about to do a full kind of econometric data analysis, I wouldn't be able to do that without significant amounts of understanding and training. And so the starting point on really thinking about interviews is that they are a skill, and that they are a skill that is developed over time. They're also really over-relied on from within qualitative research as the means and a accepted means of collecting data. That paper I've highlighted there is something which is it's very famous, well, within certain circles, it's a very well-known paper called the Interview Society, and how we tend to have a huge reliance on the interview. So I just want you to sit back and reflect on the moment of when you have been interviewed. I'm sure all of you here today have gone through an interview process, and just reflect on how that's felt. You've all come out of a job interview, I'm sure, and gone, oh, I wish I'd said that, or I wish I'd said this, or I wish I'd been able to say it in a different way. Because the interview is reliant on one particular form of communication, and that is our ability to talk, our ability to think on the spot, our ability to answer questions, and our ability to relate to the other person or other people that are in the room. In other words, the interview is an inherently relational practice, and that demands particular skills, cognitive skills, it demands particular understandings of the world, and also time as well, the ability to actually think on the spot and communicate stuff. So there are ultimately the interview, when we think about it from that perspective, is a very restrictive form of trying to understand our world. And when we think about interviewing, it's often seen as the easy option. It's often seen as the obvious option, and it's often seen as really convenient to do. We can just go out and do some interviews. So if there's one thing I'd like you all to take from today, it's that that is not the only option, and that doing good interviews requires really thinking about how that interview is conducted, and thinking about who you are, how that participant might feel about you, how you feel about the participant or group of participants, the power between individuals in the room, the questions that you're asking, the day that that person might have had that you're bringing into that interview situation. There's a wealth of literature on this. Some of the references here will take you to some of that literature. I won't go into a lot of detail. But essentially, there is a certain understanding that we are all Oprahs. And David Silverman talks about this, you know, actually, can we as interviewers really do a better job than Oprah in terms of finding out information from people? Probably not in that way. I certainly don't dress as well as Oprah does, so that would be my starting point of where I fall down. But this links to this idea of focusing on the interview, and if it is the most predominant method, how can we make it better? I'm sure all of you use predominantly have used interviews in the past. So this is about thinking about that interview, what you want to get out of it. How can you think about different ways of getting data from that interview, but also thinking about yourself as an interviewer and the skills that takes to be able to conduct an interview in a way which means you'll get the depth of data needed. Because fundamentally, within qualitative research, it is about experience and getting depth, especially if you're conducting research interviews, that depth, that totality of experience, allowing participants to kind of meander through their worlds in certain ways. And I'm talking from like a phenomenologist here, I know, but really that is sort of the forefront of understanding what research is about. But also it's about reflecting on the participants that engage in those interviews as well, thinking about what their experiences are, their identities, their ability around their abilities relating to oral fluency, for example, and their ability to communicate. I've had examples where I had a participant who was very deaf, and that really restricted their ability to be able to communicate with me, and it actually made me feel really bad, because I hadn't provided any other means other than a pen and paper for them to be able to communicate what was needed. They also, for example, for those who may be neurodivergent, require different thinking around how they access interviews, like time and space, and the type of questions that you're asking. For example, asking particular questions may mean that they don't understand what it is that you need. You might need to be more literal. These are all the things to think about. And I know there's a question around inclusivity there. So hopefully that gives you a little bit more flavor as to, not just going out and doing interviews. That is not just an answer with that. However, next slide, please. One potential way of trying to think about interviews differently is around using things in research. When we think about objects, and I took out all my favorite slides on theory of objects here, Katrina made me, but if you do want to know about it, then I'm more than happy to talk to you about it. But really this is about thinking about matter and what matters and how you use matter in your everyday life, things that you use to communicate with people, whether it be like me, I use my hands a lot, I use my body a lot to communicate, for example. So putting me in a very restrictive place will have an impact on what I communicate towards you. I'll just probably come across as uptight. So thinking about the objects that you have, and I asked you all to get an object or have something, an object around you that kind of means something to you. And I just want you to kind of pick that object up for a minute, and I want you to really look at it, to kind of feel it, to think about the way it feels, think about the edges. I've got actually I'm going to use this one because it's more like me, this sort of Lego figure here. Think about the way it feels, what it requires. Can you smell it? Are there sharp edges to it? How does it feel to you? And often we don't even think about these kind of things. It's very much just run of the mill. These are sort of everydayness experiences, that the objects that happen with the world around us. But for me, this kind of leads us to really thinking about how objects influence us and what we do, how we think, what we say. And this sort of links to understanding objects as matter. And there's a whole load of work on, for example, new materialism, actor network theory, which tries to understand the idea, the fact that humans don't come first in understanding the world, that actually there is it is also worth thinking about how objects interact with our everyday life. And for those of you from the more sort of who are doing research, or perhaps your PhDs and thinking about looking at technology and the impact technology, right now I'm surrounded by objects that are mediating the way that I talk to you. I have a screen in front of me, I have a camera in front of me, I have objects, my phone, I have books, I have food, cake, and some other thing there. All of that is having an impact on what I'm thinking, what I'm feeling, what I'm doing. And so accounting for matter, objects, and how it relates and interacts with our experiences is the first starting point when we're thinking about material methods. There are lots and lots of different ontological and epistemological, and I'm not going to talk about that, assumptions, and depending on ones you take will depend on how you talk about matter in your research. And the idea is that there are lots of different ways of thinking about objects. Who gives them, for example, what comes first? Do objects have agency, or do we have agency? Do objects affect? So there are lots of kind of big fundamental questions that I'm not going to cover today. But when you are dealing, particularly if you're doing any doctoral work or you're writing a paper or about to conduct some research, orientating yourself and really thinking about the position that that object has in your work and how individuals relate to, how the object relates to the individual is really important, because that will dictate what kind of analysis you do, the kind of questions that you ask, etc. So with the object interview, this came from a phenomenological study, an in-depth phenomenological study on entrepreneurs. And the starting point was about the idea that the phenomenological interview in its traditional format is this open-ended dialogue that you have with the participant. They're long, they're in-depth, it's in-depthly conversational. And for me, having had experience previously in conversations with Katrina, we talked about actually how restrictive that was and how it took away from the phenomenological commitments of trying to really enable participants to access their worlds. Fundamentally, when you're looking to conduct a long-range interview like a phenomenological interview, the whole point of conducting it is that depth of data. And what I mean by depth is about going beyond the sort of the conscious layer. You're trying to access people's ability to reflect on their experiences in ways they perhaps haven't before. So you are asking people to come into a room and talk about experiences which they have never been asked to talk about before. So automatically you're putting people on the spot. They may not necessarily know what to expect, particularly if you've not sent ahead any interview materials or questions. And that's something to think about if you do have people who are within the kind of neurodivergent umbrella, to think about whether sending interviews ahead of time will enable you to collect, to enable them to be able to have that time to reflect and come to the interview feeling prepared and not on the spot. I know some people who sit within the autism spectrum disorder prefer to have that. And there's much more work going on in that area to try and understand accessibility and enabling people to talk about their worlds in ways which we would love them to be able to do, and communicate their worlds in ways which don't exclude them from conversations in terms of that traditional research interview. So I used, in this object interview, which was informed by Professor Sophie Woodward's work, who's got a book, which I brought with me. Anyone knows? Material Methods, really recommend it for those of you who are just starting out using Material Methods. It's a really good introductory textbook, really accessible, really well written for those of you working in the public sector and want to start thinking about how you can use objects, or if you want to start a conversation about, some of you might persuade people on the impact of that and why it's important. This is a really good starting point for that. So one of the ways that we used objects and Lego in our research is this idea that they were used as a data elicitation tool. And the whole idea of bringing Lego into interview, and you don't have to use Lego, you can use whatever objects you can, but there is a specific reason we use Lego in this instance, is this idea that actually the interaction with objects allows for time to reflect on what people are saying, but also it allows people to construct and see their conversations in different ways. There are lots of different ways of understanding this, but things to think about when you're thinking about an object interview are you're using materials in an interview, and you're using different stuff, and bringing stuff in an interview is about the role of the researcher in that interview, and also the role of the participant. What are you going to be doing as a researcher? What are you going to be doing as a participant? And how does the role of objects interact into that process? So for me, one of the reasons why Lego was particularly good was because it is formed around this idea of play. And one of the ways that one of the challenges that comes across interviews is the power relationship between the researcher and the researched, and how often the power exists within the researcher, and that can impact upon the researched in terms of them feeling like they may not be able to converse in some ways. And again, this relates to some points around inclusion. You know, even if you get people who are from the community to do your interviews in order to gain access to hidden or marginalized groups, it's worth considering the role that person plays in the community, the cultural aspects of that community, and where that person sits, because that might have a huge impact on what the participant feels in that interview process. Again, you're bringing them into potentially an enclosed space with someone they may not know particularly well, or even someone they may know. All of that may have an impact on what they say and what they do within that research space. So the role of the participant and researcher is something to consider. Next slide, please. Thank you. So I'm going to talk through what we call the Lego method. And hopefully this is a bit of more of a practical exercise. Again, just kind of maintain that object while I'm talking, and just reflect on how it's making you feel, how you use it perhaps. When you're thinking, I'm a great fidgeter, so I love to kind of have stuff in my hand when I'm talking various ways, and that makes me feel safe when I'm, not that I feel unsafe at the moment, but you know, in certain circumstances I feel unsafe, so I have a you know, something to hold to make me feel better about the world. So that's every day at the moment. So step one with the Lego method. So what you can see here in the picture in front of you is an organized set of Lego. We use Lego Serious Play as our starting point. Lego Serious Play is an open source. Some of you may have used it for boring team building exercise, where you probably don't end up friends with anyone after you've used it. Lego Serious Play is predominantly used in industry for team building. David Gauntlet was from sort of the culture and communications world, wrote a book about using Lego in research, but predominantly with groups, and to explore identities and how people construct their identities, and using Lego as a means to help people understand themselves and also be able to talk about themselves. And that was done as a group function. So we looked at that work and we said, well, we want to use this in phenomenological interviewing because we see it as a really good way, not only for participants to be able to build their experience and construct their experience, but also to allow that time to reflect on their experiences. And there's loads of research which looks at the body in the research process, and kind of encompassing sort of the aesthetic of the research process and how people use all of themselves through that. But that's a kind of separate point. So the starting point with the Lego process is to obviously have a wide selection of Lego. You can see here it's all organized. So just to reiterate, the Lego is the object in the research interview. It's probably some confusion there. The objects that we use in that interview. So we had a whole variety of Lego laid out on the table, and then we'd set up what I would call a storyboard in the middle of the interview, with the researcher on one side and then the participant on the other. But again, this is very flexible, and it's about really thinking about who you're interviewing, the kind of space that you're in. With this method, I've sat on floors, in hairdressers, getting covered in hair. You can imagine I had many objects in my hands during that experience, but it very much depends on the space and the people that you're talking to. So the starting point really with the Lego is to set it up so that you're not wasting time, with the participant isn't wasting time finding stuff. We tried out a couple of different ways of doing this. We started with like piles of stuff on the tables in a bit more of a kind of messy and deconstructed way, and participants really found it difficult to talk and as well as reflect and then build. What we found in this sort of setting out in this organized manner, and it's similar to sandboxing in research that's used sandboxes. Everything's set out so that participants can see what's available to them, and they don't necessarily have to think about finding it. They can just go in as they're talking and you know, go and build as they're talking as well, without having to think about it. So setting it up, and that setup process is really important. It's called building rapport because walking into a building with a whole bunch of Lego and going into an interview, it's not necessarily what people expect from a research interview or any interview whatsoever. So you're not only dealing with using Lego, you're also managing the expectations of your participant. So part of that building rapport and that setup, I would always ask participants, to set up with me, and I would talk through the reasons why I'm using Lego. I talk through the interview, I talk through the record, why I would be recording it. So there's a lot of upfront work that's involved to make these methods, and particularly using objects or other creative methods, to make them work and to make the participant feel at ease. There's a lot of talk, and Harriet Shaw and Sam Warren talk about this when they're using creative methods. They talk about how part of the making sure that they go well is managing those expectations right up front, putting participants at ease. You know, if you use drawing, the first thing you think is, oh, I can't draw. Or often when I bring Lego and I set the Lego out, I go, have you played with Lego before? And it would be that, oh yeah, I love Lego, it's great, I use it with my kids all the time. So for me, it'd be about managing it and saying, well, actually, this is the way it's being used in this process, to make them think slightly differently about it. So as part of that familiarization exercise, I would get participants to build themselves in Lego. Something like this. And then there was also objects they could use, you know, there's a magnifying glass here, like that sort of thing. You get them to build themselves, and that's a kind of the starting point. And again, if you're using any other objects, that familiarization piece is really imperative. You're putting the participant at ease, not asking them any difficult questions. You ask them to build themselves. Similarly, you can, if you're doing drawing, anything like that, you can do that. So I would then, in order to get participants familiar with using the object and talking, would then ask them to talk through what they built. And, you know, even if it's just a basic description, or often the times would be that people would put a lot of thought into themselves and their Lego selves, so they would talk through that. And then you'd say, well, that, you know, this is kind of how the interview process is moving, this is how we're going to start. And then you begin to start opening those questions. Next slide, please. So you can see there's a lot of upfront work that's involved in getting people prepared and coaching people. And again, it's similar to interviewing. People forget that actually, in order to get a good interview, part of that is coaching the participant in what you want from them, without directly leading them, of course. So step 2 is getting into the grips of the interview. So the Lego method follows what's known as a build, talk, build approach. This is where you have a broad question that you ask. So tell me about a time, or you mentioned this, you know, I would start, for example, with talk to me about, you know, setting up your business as a starting point. And then they would start talking about that. And then they might say something like, you know, I went through a divorce and I had a really difficult time. So I would say, well, is that something that we can build? And the participant would say, oh yeah, okay, let's build it. And generally, most of the time, participants were really keen to start using and build this. So what you can see in front of you is that picture of the actual divorce, and the reason why this participant's particular experience was impacted. So the impact of setting up a business was really impacted by, you know, the divorce they went through, etc. And actually trying to run a business with a partner proved to be really difficult. So we were looking at the relationship between the two of them and how they made sense of that time. So as the participant builds, you're looking at how they're building their model, but also probing and asking them questions as they're building it. And the participant, generally participants, what they'll do is they'll talk while they're building, and they'll say, oh, you know, and it was just really awful time, and they'll just be really busy just getting into the build. But also you as a researcher and as an interviewer need to pay attention about what's being said. And I'd often just write general notes down to probe later from that build process. Once they've completed the build, I'd always ask participants to name what they built. So you as a researcher don't name it. It's not your construction, it's the participants. So you'd name it, and you'd also put a code against it as to what time it happened in the interview, whether that's ABC or 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. So you can see this is quite late on in an interview, this build. So sort of coded with the number 7, but also the participant talked about it as a conflict of interest. And that was how they talked about that particular period of their time as to, you know, why things didn't necessarily go the way that they planned. And what that does is then creates a timeline and an arc, what we call an interview arc, of the story the participants are telling. And it means that the participants can then look through what they've built, and they can trace the arc through the codes and the post-its. Some participants, one of the other things that I'd also ask participants to do is to help me take a picture of the builds. And this happened in different ways. At first I would take a picture, but after a couple of interviews, our participants would ask to take the picture themselves. And so the method actually changed when we were sort of developing it, in that we enabled and asked participants if they could take images themselves. And again, this relates back to this sort of multimodal part of allowing participants to construct their own data. How I might take the image may not be how the participant wants me to see it during that interpretation process. So you take an image of that picture and you go on that image with the post-it as well, so that when you're going through your analysis later, you can see how the image and where that image sits in relation to what participants are talking about. What's really interesting is that the builds aren't set, and that participants can interact with their builds at any time. And often what you find is, because there's a certain level of circularity to how people talk about their experiences, they would start at the beginning with their build about themselves, for example, and down right at the end, they would then go back and rebuild themselves. They would say, well, actually, that's not, you know, based on what I've talked about here, that's not actually how I see myself, or I construct myself. Can I change it? So allowing here that flexibility for the participants to really engage with the objects and see them as truly reflective of their experiences is important, because as a researcher, that's not what I'm interested in. I'm interested to hear much more about the participants' reflection. Participants will be reflecting, and they will develop that level of reflection through the interview, so that time element comes in as well. But what I found in using these objects was that the level of reflection was much more in depth, much more quickly, and you know, there's a whole multitude of reasons why that might be, but ultimately it was something which really seemed to help the participants. At times it felt like I wasn't even in the room. It was just the participants completely took control of the process, because I would sometimes try and help build and get told off for trying to help. I would ask about particular elements of builds, and participants would sometimes get frustrated that I wasn't necessarily asking the right questions, and they would talk about it in different ways. So when we talk about power in the interview process and the interaction of the object, and how objects impact how people talk about their experiences, it had a huge impact within these particular interviews, and participants really owned it as well. Next slide, please. So the final stage of the Lego method, when we're thinking about object interviews, is this deconstructing talk. So this idea that participants, and obviously as a researcher interpreting what they're saying, you are continually reconstructing and constructing what's being said. Nothing is new, there's no new knowledge, it's nothing about that. What you are simply trying to get is that participant to talk about their experience or their world or that particular topic in that particular way, as in-depth as possible. That is your only concern in that space and in that mode. So towards the end of the interview, once we've been through the build, you can see an example of the kind of storyboard here. There's different builds here. It's all a bit of a mess. But the important thing is that mess makes sense to the participant, because the participant knows what that is. So I would always ask towards the end of the interview and invite participants the opportunity to build anything else that was significant, to ensure that the questions I'd asked hadn't led them away from what they wanted to communicate and what they wanted to talk about. And sometimes those questions provided the best and most in-depth and most sometimes the most kind of emotionally the most emotional times actually in some of the interviews, where participants they'd had 2 hours to kind of build through their experiences, and they look back and you're thinking about, think about the times where we get to think about particular moments in our lives, and you imagine sitting in a room for 2.5, 3 hours and just having the space to talk about it, and it's about being really sensitive to that, and sensitive to the fact that you might not be talking about a topic which is not necessarily personal to you, like starting a business or a job or an HR policy, but actually it might be incredibly sensitive to that participant. So that time at the end, that deconstructing talk time, is a really important time to reflect and understand on the fact that actually interviews and research interviews are incredibly invasive, and particularly if you're trying to get that depth, you're also adding that additional level of focus as well. So allowing that space at the end for participants to look at what they built and they constructed, so building themselves and the world, allowed for that time for participants to just talk about, even sometimes participants just say, they'd have sort of these kind of reflections and unconscious, they just go on sort of unconscious tangents of, I just can't believe this all happened to me, and they would just talk out loud about some of these things, almost decompress to some extent. And that decompression time was really important, particularly in this process. So you then ensure that time is taken, that participants are happy with what's been constructed. After all, it's their representations, it's their constructions. And you'd also go through images taken and ensure that participants are happy with the images are taken. Obviously, anonymity, taking into account ethical considerations, ensuring that there's no identifying features. So if, for example, if there was a hand or a bit of clothing, I would ask participants if that was okay, that was in the image. And if they consented and they were happy with that, then that was absolutely fine. And then the final part really is when thinking about the Lego. And again, I just want to reiterate, it's not just about Lego, it can be any form of objects, and thinking about how objects are mediate and impact that process is the starting point that I'm trying to get to here. But really the whole interview, the whole space you're in and the time you're in with that participant is data. And it's whether you're journaling or taking, field notes, etc. It is worth thinking about. I would often use the end of the interview to ask participants. Participants often, they finish the interview and then they go, oh, well, that's a relief, isn't it? And they'd come out of the interview and then we tidy up together. But I would always use that tidying up process to ask them how they found it. And then they talk to me about some other things that come up, or they say something very significant, which they hadn't said in the interview. So that time of the tidying away was also part of the interview. And again, I was very careful to ask participants' consent around if I could use particular things that they said, and continually asking consent through the interview is really important. Consent doesn't happen as a starting point or an end point. Consent happens is continually relational. You're continually asking, are you okay to talk about that? Can we move across this? Because remember, you are being an invader in these people's lives. Just because they've signed a consent form does not mean that you automatically have the permission to be able to access parts of their lives they may not want you to. So asking for that continual consent is really important. Again, there's loads of literature on that if you want. So once you've tidied up, you can see that example there. You have this absolutely fantastic, you're left with not just a recording from your dictaphone of the interview, you're not left with the transcript, but you've got this visual data, and you've got these constructions that participants have built through that. So it provides this aesthetic, and the aesthetic of the interview is captured in that particular way. You can see also there that it's not just about bricks and buildings, but there's also lots of different objects. So animals play a huge role in people using metaphors to talk about their experiences, and the objects and the Lego that was used in particular, or Duplo in this case, participants used a lot to really think about how they wanted to talk about their experience. So I had one participant who really struggled in communicating. They were very dyslexic. They hadn't their schooling was they'd left school before their GCSEs, etc. And they were incredibly nervous about doing the interview. But they absolutely loved the Lego, and the Lego helped them talk about particular situations. So they used the animals all the time to talk about themselves and to talk about other people. So it just provided another means to talk about their world and to talk about their experiences, means which they may not have been able to have if it was just through a sort of an ordinary dialogue between the researcher and the participant. Next slide, please. Okay, so just to finish up, I hope that gives you sort of a snapshot of the interview. And the one thing I want to press is that these methods aren't things you can just pull off the shelf and go, well, I'm just going to use Lego and go into an interview. You have to be positioned, and the questions that you're asking have to be positioned in such a way that they are relevant to using either objects in your research or matter in your research. So if you're using, for example, so if your question is around technology and how people interact with technology, and you're looking through a sort of social material lens, then objects play a really fundamental role, and should play a really fundamental role in how you think about how data is constructed and deconstructed through your research process. So when we're thinking about using objects in your research, there are loads of opportunities, and there are equally loads of challenges here. One of the things which I get overly excited about in my geekdom is this idea of collecting as a base for collecting longitudinal data. the fact that you can take constructions, particularly with Lego, and it's something that I would love to be able to do, is to take Lego constructions back to participants and take them through the experience and ask them how they, and get them to rebuild them or reconstruct them and look at how they would change. This is really interesting, particularly if you're looking at identities or really complicated aspects of people's lives that they may not necessarily wish to explore in particular ways. Going back to participants or going further along and getting to talk to build other objects, so you get these constructions through time and get this sort of longitudinal almost database of images that participants have constructed themselves. Wouldn't that be cool? And then the other thing that's really great is that participants have a really active role in the data construction process and co-creation process. They're active because as an individual, you are continually checking with your participant to see what they've constructed is what they're happy with. Are they happy with that representation of that particular experience? Are they, happy with the images that you've taken in terms of how that represents the construction that they've built? More importantly, when you're moving forward to your analysis, one of the things that can be really useful, and I did when through this particular piece of research, as I was rebuild participants' models as a when I was trying to do the data interpretation, I found rebuilding their models was really important to trying to put myself in that part in the participants' world, which is a key part of phenomenological research. So you're trying to place yourself in that person's world. You'll never truly understand or be that person, but the commitment to try and understand their world is there. And part of that process was trying to rebuild those models, or if you're using images, trying to redraw that image or going back to it and looking at it, etc., in relation to perhaps the text you might be analysing. Again, it's something that you can use in your research teams, and there's been a lot of talk around inclusion and diversity and how you make research more inclusive. There's been talk about reflexivity. Reflexivity doesn't come naturally to us, this ability to reflect on particularly if you come from a critical orientation, this ability to kind of reflect on your assumptions about the world, about other people, and how they impact anything that you're doing, whether it be research, whether it be looking at images, whether it be in your jobs, whether it be if you're line managing people. Thinking about those assumptions and the way that they impact other people and impact yourself is a really core part of learning to be more aware of the world around you and how you impact the world and how other people impact it. And Lego particularly formed a really good part for us as a research team, as a reflexive tool, sort of building it together, building on understandings of the world is really important. And that kind of links to that final point as well. So on the challenges then, just to finish up, and there are always challenges, and Katrina mentioned quite a few of them that relate to this piece of work as well. Logistics and practicalities, probably don't need to talk about that in a lot of detail. It's very self-explanatory. Walking around with loads of Lego isn't always the easiest thing to do, so thinking about how you're going to do that. Lego is also really expensive. Cheaper alternatives are available, like Gego or something like that, those are things to consider. But there are lots of objects that you can use that aren't expensive, conversely. You really need to be aware of who you're using the objects with or the Lego with and how they might react to that. So it demands an additional level of awareness. It's not just like turning up and doing a bog standard, question interview, talk. It demands a bit more than that. Links to academic identity and this idea of toys and play. People would laugh at us for a lot of the work that we do. They find it funny. And this is something that we face a lot of the time, that we're just playing and using toys in our work. And this is something which we are continually dealing with and managing, and we write about, etc. And I'm sure there'll be some questions on that we can come to. But really justifying it theoretically is the key, particularly if you're doing and want to publish this. And this kind of work is being very clear conceptually on your position and theoretically sound on why you're using it. And that's it really. It's things about interview management, which I've talked about, and thinking about your positionality. Again, it's not off the shelf. It's about really thinking about the role that objects play in all our lives and every day.
So we've dealt with quite a lot of questions in the chat there, Helen, as we've been going along, and I'm aware that we're probably slightly heading towards the end of the session, but are there, so there have been quite a lot of questions about, which I have answered, but I shall pass on a couple of them, about dealing with, let's call it resistance in the interview. So how to tackle when a participant feels uncomfortable with the Lego. And I think we've said in the chat, or I've said in the chat, that it's really about letting the participant take the lead on how persistent you are with a Lego or offering alternatives. Any additional thoughts on that one?
Yeah, I think that's it. And I'd also say, thinking about autism and the fact that the interview is inherently social, if you are neurodivergent yourself and you're a researcher yourself, you may not always pick up on those social cues. And so it can be a little bit more challenging. So it's just about being really open and upfront from the start, saying, if you're finding this difficult, let me know, and just having that open and honest conversation up front, and letting the participants know they don't have to do anything. They can just talk if that's what they're comfortable with. It's about allowing the space for participants to choose what they want. I'd also have pens and paper available. So participants wanted to draw and they didn't want to build, then the option was there. So it's about allowing participants to find what they're comfortable with rather than you putting it upon them.
Okay, thanks for that. And another question that came up was the approach to rebuilding during analysis. Perhaps if you could just give us a couple more sentences on that one, and then we'll see if there's any more questions across the patch, although we are obviously heading towards the end of time at the minute.
Yeah, so so it very much depends on the analytic frame and the analytic process you're using. Different forms of analysis will demand different levels of interpretation with your data and closeness with your data. So I was talking about analysis with interpretive phenomenological analysis, which demands an exceptionally closeness to your data. And obviously with that phenomenological commitment of trying to understand that participant's world. So the process really was during the sort of later stages of the analysis, after you've done sort of initial coding, I would then, if there were places where I was really struggling with what participants were trying to mean, I'd return. So if there was a particular quotation or something I was trying to get to grips with, I would return to their build at the time. And part of trying to work through that, because a lot of analysis is about working through meaning and trying to make sense of meaning. And that was, the rebuilding was part of that process. And I found it wasn't just about looking at text, it was about actually interacting with what the participants were interacting with, and that just allowed that different level of space and different level of access.
Thank you. There are a few more questions coming in, but I think what we will do in the interest of time, because I'm aware that the numbers are ticking down now as people are leaving, is to
I often have that.
We'll follow up that on the with a sort of, we'll go through the questions and we'll post them on our website. So we were going to do sort of wrap up and questions and answers. We're happy to, I think I'm saying all right in saying this, Helen, that we're both happy to stay on and answer some more questions if people want to stay on after 4 o'clock. We did have some questions that we were going to ask you in terms of interest in subsequent sessions, if you're interested in finding out more, but perhaps we will be able to do that via emailing those that attended those questions rather than necessarily picking them up today, because I'm aware we're probably going to only get about half of the participants able to respond on that. But if you do still have the Slido code and you go on to Slido, you will find that there are a couple more questions for you to answer. We won't hang on these now, but asking you if you'd like some more sessions and how you would like them. Now I can't move on. And also what topics you'd like them on. So that would be really useful. And we can also follow up via those of you that have registered for the session and ask you those, I believe. So I think we'll have a look and go through some final questions, but obviously we're probably going to stop the recording at this point, particularly because the dog has decided to